Did you ever notice that there is a gap in the Bible? The scrolls speak of Jesus as a child of 12 in the temple, astounding the elders with his wisdom. Then suddenly the narrative jumps forward. He reappears at age 30, baptized in the Jordan River, ready to begin his ministry. What happened during those 18 years? Where was the most influential spiritual figure in Western history during the prime of his youth? This isn't just a minor footnote in religious history. It's perhaps the most significant untold story in human spiritual development. A deliberate omission that shapes how billions understand spirituality itself. These missing years aren't simply undocumented. They were systematically erased from the official record. The question isn't just where Jesus was during this time, but why these chapters of his life were so carefully removed from the narrative that would become Christianity. Imagine discovering that the foundation of Western spiritual thought was built on only a fraction of its originator's actual journey. What if Jesus, far from being solely a product of Jewish tradition, had actually spent his formative years absorbing wisdom from the most advanced spiritual traditions across Asia? What would that mean for how we understand his teachings, his mission, and the artificial boundaries we've placed between East and West? The evidence, hiding in plain sight, suggests something remarkable. During these lost years, Jesus traveled far beyond the borders of Judea, following ancient trade routes that had connected the Mediterranean world to India, Tibet, and Persia for centuries. In monasteries, temples, and mystery schools across the ancient world, the young Jesus didn't just study. He mastered esoteric knowledge that would later inform his revolutionary teachings. Let's begin by understanding what the official records tell us, and more importantly, what they don't. The canonical Gospels mention Jesus at his birth and during an incident at age 12, when he debated with teachers in the Jerusalem temple. Then, silence descends until he emerges at 30 to begin his public ministry. This 18-year gap represents 60% of Jesus' life before his teaching began, a staggering omission for supposedly comprehensive biographies. This gap becomes even more suspicious when you realize it wasn't always empty. During the formative centuries of Christianity, numerous texts circulated describing Jesus' activities during these years. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Arabic Infancy Gospel, and fragments of other narratives picked up where the canonical Gospels fell silent. Yet, these were systematically excluded when the official canon was established at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE under Emperor Constantine's watchful eye. Why? Because many of these accounts describe Jesus traveling far beyond the borders of Judea, studying with Eastern masters and Egyptian initiates, a narrative that didn't fit the emerging theological framework being constructed by the Roman Church. A Jesus who studied with Buddhist monks or Brahmin priests in India, who learned secret teachings in Himalayan monasteries, or who was initiated into Egyptian mystery schools, would undermine the claim that his wisdom was exclusive and unique, rather than part of a universal spiritual tradition. The historical context makes these journeys not only possible, but probable. The ancient world was far more interconnected than most people realize. By the 1st century CE, established trade routes connected the Roman Empire to India and China. The Silk Road was already centuries old. Alexandria in Egypt served as the intellectual crossroads of the ancient world, housing the greatest library ever assembled and attracting scholars from across the known world. Jewish communities had already spread throughout this expansive network. Significant Jewish populations existed in Alexandria, Babylon, Persia, and even as far as India, establishing synagogues and maintaining cultural connections to Jerusalem. A young Jewish man with unusual spiritual interests would have had access to well-established pathways connecting these distant Jewish communities. Consider also the historical timing of Jesus' youth. During exactly these lost years, the Roman Empire was experiencing its most peaceful and stable period, the Pax Romana, making long-distance travel safer than perhaps any time before the modern era. The conditions for extensive travel couldn't have been more perfect during precisely the period that disappeared from Jesus' biography. But speculation alone isn't enough. What actual evidence suggests Jesus traveled extensively during these unrecorded years? The trail begins in strange places, including ancient Buddhist texts that mention a foreign sage named Isa, who came from the West to study in India and Tibet, during exactly this time period. In 1887, Russian explorer Nicholas Notovich claimed to have discovered ancient manuscripts at the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, detailing the visits of Jesus, called Isa, to India and Tibet. According to these texts, Jesus spent years studying with Buddhist monks and Hindu sages, mastering meditation techniques and philosophical systems before returning to his homeland. While Notovich's claims have been disputed, subsequent researchers, including Swami Abhedananda and Nicholas Roerich, claim to have independently verified the existence of these manuscripts. More compelling are the striking philosophical parallels between Jesus' teaching and Eastern traditions. The concept of loving one's enemies, nonviolence, and many of the parables Jesus taught bear remarkable similarities to Buddhist teachings that predated him by 5 centuries. His emphasis on the kingdom within, rather than an external salvation, mirrors Vedantic concepts of self-realization. These aren't vague resemblances, but specific philosophical frameworks that were absent in the Jewish tradition of his time. The clearest linguistic evidence comes from Jesus' own unusual terminology. When Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, a phrase he uses repeatedly, he employs the Aramaic term bar nasha. This exact phrase was commonly used in Buddhist texts, translated into Aramaic during this period, to describe an enlightened being, someone who had transcended ordinary consciousness. It is a specific technical term that appears in Buddhist literature, translated into Aramaic in northern India and Bactria, regions with established Jewish communities. Similarly, Jesus' frequent use of the term the way to describe his spiritual path directly parallels the Buddhist concept of the path and the Taoist concept of the way, Tao. These aren't coincidental similarities, but specific technical terminology from Eastern spiritual traditions that somehow found their way into Jesus' vocabulary. The evidence extends beyond texts to archaeology. In Kashmir, there exists a tomb known as Rosabal that local tradition has long identified as the tomb of Uz Asaf, a prophet who came from the West and taught spiritual wisdom remarkably similar to Jesus' teachings. The name Uz Asaf has been interpreted by some scholars as a derivation of Jesus the Gatherer. The tomb is oriented in an east-west direction, following Jewish burial customs, rather than the north-south orientation of Islamic graves. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from Jesus' teachings themselves. When he finally emerged at 30 to begin his public ministry, Jesus taught with an authority and depth that astonished even the religious scholars of his time. The question his contemporaries repeatedly asked, "Where did this man get this wisdom?" reflects their recognition that his teaching transcended the traditional education available in Galilee. He displayed a comprehensive understanding of multiple spiritual traditions, often synthesizing and transcending them in ways that suggested extensive study and mastery. Consider the famous Sermon on the Mount. Biblical scholars have long noted that this teaching represents a radical departure from traditional Jewish thought of the time. However, when compared with Buddhist sutras, particularly the Dhammapada, striking parallels emerge. The Beatitudes, with their emphasis on the spiritual benefits of humility, compassion, and peacemaking, closely mirror Buddhist teachings on the path to enlightenment. Jesus' emphasis on overcoming attachment and desire resonates deeply with core Buddhist principles. Even Jesus' method of teaching, his use of parables and koan-like questions, bears striking resemblance to Zen Buddhist teaching techniques. His instruction to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves parallels Taoist concepts of balancing opposing forces. His teaching that the kingdom of heaven is within you echoes the Upanishadic concept that the divine dwells within each person as Atman. None of these concepts had precedent in Jewish teaching of the time. The question isn't whether Jesus expressed ideas similar to Eastern philosophies. That is evident in the texts. The real question is, how did he come to possess such knowledge if not through direct contact and study? The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine Jesus' healing techniques. His methods of healing through touch, the transfer of energy, and the emphasis on the faith of the recipient all have direct parallels in Eastern healing traditions, particularly in Ayurvedic and Tibetan medical practices. His frequent retreats into solitude for meditation similarly reflect Eastern spiritual disciplines, rather than Jewish religious practices of his era. Egypt, too, appears to have played a crucial role in Jesus' development. Matthew's Gospel briefly mentions that Jesus' family fled to Egypt when he was an infant to escape Herod's persecution, but it provides no details about their time there or when they returned. Egypt had been the center of esoteric knowledge for millennia, home to mystery schools that preserved ancient wisdom about consciousness, energy, and spiritual transformation. Alexandria, with its famous library and museum, had become the intellectual crossroads where Greek philosophy, Jewish theology, Egyptian mysteries, and Eastern wisdom all converged. The Therapeutae, a Jewish contemplative community near Alexandria, described by Philo, practiced healing and meditation techniques remarkably similar to those Jesus would later employ. Their name itself means healers, the same description often applied to Jesus. The connections between Jesus' teachings and Egyptian mysticism become evident in symbolic elements of his ministry. His emphasis on resurrection parallels the central Osirian mysteries. His reference to being born again echoes initiation language from Egyptian mystery traditions. Even his famous statement, "Before Abraham was, I am," mirrors the ancient Egyptian concept of the eternal nature of consciousness, as expressed in the phrase, "I am that I am," associated with Egyptian mysticism. These aren't casual resemblances, but specific theological and philosophical concepts that were preserved and taught within the Egyptian mystery tradition. Jesus' sophisticated understanding of these principles suggests direct contact with these teaching lineages. But why would all this be hidden? Why would the early church systematically remove these chapters from Jesus' story? The answer lies in the politics of the emerging Christian religion, as it sought to establish itself as distinct and exclusive. By the 4th century CE, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, church leaders faced a significant challenge: how to position their faith as unique and superior to the many competing spiritual traditions of the time. A Jesus who had studied with Eastern masters, who had been initiated into Egyptian mysteries, who drew wisdom from multiple sources. This portrayal would undermine the claim of Christianity's exclusive truth. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, and subsequent councils, didn't just establish Christian doctrine, they actively suppressed alternative narratives about Jesus' life and teachings. Texts mentioning his Eastern journeys or studies in Egypt were declared heretical, burned, or simply not copied, ensuring their gradual disappearance. What remained was a carefully curated story that served the institutional needs of the emerging church hierarchy. This erasure wasn't just historical revisionism, it represented a fundamental shift in how Western spirituality would develop. By severing Jesus from his connection to Eastern wisdom and Egyptian mysteries, the Western spiritual tradition was artificially separated from its Eastern counterparts, creating a false division that persists to this day. What might have been recognized as different expressions of universal spiritual principles instead became competing religious systems. So what does this mean for us today? How does recognizing Jesus' probable journey across the spiritual traditions of his time change how we understand his teachings and our own spiritual paths? First, it invites us to read Jesus' words with fresh eyes. When he says, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," we can recognize the echo of the Upanishadic teaching, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art, the recognition that divine consciousness dwells within each person. When he teaches nonviolence and love of enemies, we can see the influence of Buddhist compassion practices. His emphasis on being in the world, but not of the world, parallels Taoist concepts of action without attachment. This recognition doesn't diminish Jesus' significance, but expands it. Rather than seeing him as the founder of a separate religion, we can appreciate him as a master synthesizer who experienced the depth of multiple wisdom traditions and distilled their essence into teachings accessible to his cultural context. He becomes a bridge figure, one who recognized the universal principles underlying diverse spiritual paths. For your own spiritual journey, this perspective offers liberation from artificial boundaries. The practices of meditation, compassion cultivation, and present-moment awareness taught in Eastern traditions aren't foreign to Jesus' path, but integral to it. You don't need to choose between following Jesus and exploring mindfulness, meditation, yoga philosophy, or other Eastern practices. These were likely part of his own development. Try this simple practice that Jesus himself may have learned during his time in the East. For 5 minutes each day, sit in silence and focus your attention on your breath. When thoughts arise, simply notice them without judgment and return to your breath. This basic mindfulness practice, central to Buddhist tradition, aligns perfectly with Jesus' emphasis on watchfulness and inner awareness. His instruction to enter your closet to pray describes the same inward turning that meditation facilitates. Another practical application involves reading the Gospels alongside Eastern texts like the Dhammapada, the Tao Te Ching, or the Upanishads. Notice the parallels in teachings about non-attachment, compassion, and the illusory nature of material wealth. This comparative study reveals the universal wisdom that transcends cultural boundaries, exactly what Jesus would have discovered during his travels. When Jesus teaches, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you," try practicing the Buddhist metta, loving-kindness meditation, sending good wishes even to those who have harmed you. This practice brings his teaching to life in a way that mere intellectual understanding cannot. It's likely the very technique Jesus himself used to achieve the remarkable compassion he demonstrated. For those interested in healing practices, explore the concept of prana, the life energy that flows through all things. Jesus' healing work frequently involved the transmission of energy through touch, suggesting familiarity with these Eastern healing principles. Learning basic energy practices can connect you to this aspect of his ministry that conventional Christianity has largely forgotten. Even Jesus' teaching methods reflect Eastern influences. His use of paradox and non-dual thinking challenges the either-or mentality of Western thought. Practice holding contradictory ideas simultaneously without immediately trying to resolve them. Allow the tension to open your mind to deeper understanding. This approach to knowledge reflects the non-dual awareness central to many Eastern contemplative traditions. Perhaps most importantly, recognizing Jesus as a traveler between worlds encourages us to become spiritual bridge builders ourselves. In a world still fragmented by religious divisions, we can follow his example by seeking the universal wisdom that underlies diverse traditions. Rather than clinging to exclusive claims, we can embrace the complementary insights each path offers into our shared human experience. The story of Jesus' hidden years invites us to question not just the official narrative of his life, but the artificial boundaries we've created between wisdom traditions. What if there is only one universal path, expressed through different cultural languages? What if Jesus recognized this and attempted to translate Eastern insights into forms his Mediterranean audience could understand? This perspective transforms Jesus from a divisive figure, claimed by one religion to the exclusion of others, into a unifying one, who embodied the principle that truth transcends cultural boundaries. His missing years represent not just a biographical curiosity, but a key to unlocking a more universal understanding of spirituality itself. When we examine closely the core principles Jesus taught, compassion, non-attachment, meditative awareness, and recognition of the divine within, we find the same golden thread that runs through the heart of all authentic spiritual traditions. What if his journey across the spiritual landscape of the ancient world wasn't coincidental, but essential to his mission of revealing this universal core? The question then becomes not whether Jesus studied in India, Tibet, or Egypt, but how this understanding transforms our approach to spiritual growth. If Jesus himself recognized the value in multiple traditions, might our own spiritual development be enriched by similar openness? If he discovered universal principles beneath cultural expressions, might we benefit from doing the same? As you reflect on this hidden chapter of Jesus' life, consider your own spiritual journey. Are you limiting yourself to a single tradition when a more universal wisdom awaits? Are you drawing artificial boundaries between paths that might actually complement each other? Jesus' example suggests that the deepest spiritual understanding comes not from isolation, but from integration. Not from building walls, but from building bridges. The most profound implication of Jesus' hidden years is that the divine reveals itself not exclusively through one tradition, but universally through many. The light he spoke of shines not just through one window, but through countless openings, each offering a different yet valid perspective on the same transcendent reality. By recovering this missing chapter of his life, we recover a more complete understanding, not just of who Jesus was, but of who we might become.